Hello, welcome. Good afternoon. I want to welcome you to Book Passage and our author conversation. I'm Allison Bainbridge, and I want to thank you so much for joining us today to celebrate the #1 New York Times bestselling author, Mark Nepo, for a transformational conversation with Brooke Warner on his new book, Falling Down and Getting Up, Discovering Your Inner Resilience and Strength. I'm holding it up now. It's a beautiful cover. We were just talking about how lovely it is. And that's definitely something, when I look at it, it radiates what the book says inside. The following inspirational quote by Mark Nepo is a perfect introduction to this incredible book. When medieval monks were asked how they practiced their faith, they said, by falling down and getting up. This is a human journey from which no one is exempt. So many of us can relate to this. And often when we fall down, we're not sure how to get up and we need a little advice. So Mark is graciously guiding us with this wonderful book. Every day we must choose between surviving and thriving, managing risk and enhancing it, opening ourselves or closing off. Mark guides readers in navigating these choices with grace and fortitude while embracing the rhythm inherent to every stage of life, falling down and getting up. This book focuses on the individual's transformative journey with all its ups and downs and twists and turns, filled with humble insights and wise words. This book will encourage and inspire readers from every walk of life. Down and Getting Up will introduce readers to their own gifts and wisdom. So many of us have it inside and just need help accessing it, helping them explore the choice points and perennial practices we all face in life. Mark is a master teacher who's been convening circles and guiding retreats for more than 50 years all over the world. He's beloved as a poet, teacher, and storyteller, and he's been called one of the finest spiritual guides of our time, a consummate storyteller, and an eloquent spiritual teacher. He is a cancer survivor, and he devotes his writing and teaching to the journey of inner transformation and the life of relationship. His work has been translated into more than 20 languages, and he's published, actually, this is his 25th book. I can't wait to hear the upcoming discussion. We're also so fortunate to have Brooke Warner in conversation. She's a publisher of She Writes Press, which is a fabulous publishing company. Many of the books that come out of their book passage hosts debut events. And so we are just so honored to be a supporter of She Writes Press. Brooke is also the president of Warner Coaching Incorporated and author of Write On Sisters, Greenlight Your Book, What's Your Book, and 3 books on memoir. She writes a regular column for Publishers Weekly as well. So please join me in giving a very warm virtual welcome to Mark and Brooke.
Thank you so much for that, Allison, and thank you to Book Passage. Mark and I both love Book Passage so much, and I'm so honored to be here virtually with Book Passage and in celebration of you, my dear friend, Mark Nepo. And we're celebrating Mark's latest book, Falling Down and Getting Up, Discovering Your Inner Resilience and Strength. The book was published just a few weeks ago. Congratulations. And you can buy it through Book Passage. We certainly hope you will. Book Passage does ship anywhere and everywhere. So that's an important thing to remember, not only for this book, but for any of your books. I also want to specifically thank Book Passage for creating the gift of this space and all of the events that they do. In fact, since the beginning of the pandemic, Book Passage has been putting on multiple events per day, giving all of us opportunities to be in conversation and to hear from authors just like Mark. So Allison gave a gorgeous intro, but I'm going to say a few words. Mark is a poet and spiritual teacher, of course, an author, best known for his profound day book, The Book of Awakening, which is the New York Times best-selling book that has sold over 1 million copies. And I have had the great privilege to be working with Mark for the past 13 years. I support Mark with events. We do a lot of things together, particularly since the pandemic, Mark. My gosh, a lot of pivoting to online. As Allison said, this book, Falling Down and Getting Up, is his 25th book. And when I read this book, I was reminded just how much Mark always meets the thresholds that we face in living. And like so many of Mark's books, this book is about the journey of the heart, the work of the heart, which is, a central theme of Mark's work. It's a book that supports us to be with our suffering without breaking, to draw comfort and support from those who've come before us. And those of you who know and love Mark's work know what a tremendous storyteller he is. Every single story in this book is resonant. And Mark, this book in particular is calming. When I read it, I felt like I could drop into a moment of truth and deeper knowing. And it's so important right now, especially because even though the pandemic is over, people are still, of course, suffering, and there's a lot of overwhelm in the world. And this book is just such a gorgeous companion. So thank you, congratulations, and thank you especially for inviting me to be in conversation with you.
Oh, thank you so much, Brooke, and thank you, Allison and Zach, and everyone at Book Passage. It's just wonderful to be able to partner with you and all the good work. And yes, thank you, Brooke, so much. It's such a joy for us to work together. And welcome to all of you. Thank you for taking time to be together this way for a little bit on a Sunday. So let me give you a sense of our time here. We'll be together for 90 minutes, and this first half hour, Brooke and I will be in conversation about the new book. And in the second half hour, I'd like to share some poems and stories, mostly from my book, The Half-Life of Angels, which is a poetry collection that came out in April, and a couple of new things. And then the final half hour, we welcome your questions. If there are things that touch you as we're sharing, please bookmark them and put them in the chat or the question wherever you're directed, so that we can be in a conversation afterwards. So again, I want to thank everyone. And yeah, Brooke, let's explore the new book.
Absolutely. I'm excited to do so. And I think we need to start from the beginning. What led you to write this book in the first place?
Well, this is very, interesting that this book, especially my publisher and editor at St. Martin's Essentials, Joel Fotinos, who is just a wonderful, wonderful man, learned man. And he kept asking me, he said, you teach more than a lot of my authors. And he kept inquiring about that and what's that like and what's that look like. And so finally he asked me this wonderful question. He said, if someone couldn't be in one of your circles in person, what kind of book would you write that would be closest to that experience? I thought, oh my God, what an invitation. And that was when this book was born. And like all my other books, it quickly became my teacher. And so that was how this started. And it was then kind of incubating during the pandemic. And so it led to a lot of depth in unexpected areas as well.
Well, and let's talk about the themes because it's wide ranging, but the subtitle also speaks specifically to inner strength and resilience.
Well, what it explores, and I want to share, folks who we've worked together before, my work, is, exploring these books, each one is an inquiry. And what I share as an author and a teacher are examples, not instructions. I learn from each journey, and so and as I go on in my life, I'm now 72, which when I met someone my age when I was younger, I thought they were ancient. It doesn't seem so old right now. But these books become integrative on the path. And so this book explores perennial practices that we all face to live a full life. And so there's a constellation of them, but all of them, I wish there were like how to or easy steps, A, B, and C for different things we face, but they're not.
Mhm.
Every one of us is forced by life to find and return to a corridor of aliveness. And we do that by inhabiting the rhythms of all these choice points. And let me just kind of offer a few that the book goes into in depth. One is that every person who's ever lived has to both survive and thrive. Now, if all you do is survive and you don't thrive, what's the point? But we can't just thrive and pay no attention to survival or we won't last very long. You know, you and I could have this wonderful, deep conversation walking out while we're crossing a highway. And if we don't pay attention, we'll get hit by a truck and that will be the end of that. So we have to find, where is this balance? So the second kind of choice point that's explored in the book as well is managing risk and enhancing risk. So in the outer world, as I just by that example, we have to manage risk. We have to be prudent about where we are and what we're doing. Now, if we overdo that, we don't live life, we wind up hiding. But the other extreme is we take too much risk. Now this is because enhancing risk in the inner world is what gives us meaning and connection. And if I don't take risks, I don't grow. And so if I don't grow inwardly, then I wind up taking needless risk outwardly. So a couple of other kind of choice points: opening and closing, giving and receiving. And just as, you know, I'm inhaling and exhaling as we're talking, you have to do both. You have to do all of these things. You can't just inhale only or exhale only. So you have to open and close. You have to give and receive. What's the balance for you that allows you to return to that corridor of aliveness? So a couple of other big ones are the balance between solitude and community. You know, it doesn't matter whether you're an introvert or an extrovert. We we reaffirm our direct experience of life when we're really alone. This is what presence does. But we affirm our belonging through relationship, and that leads to community. So these are some of the things, and we go into others in the book. But as Allison mentioned, you know, my commitment through all these years and continuing is to introduce my students and readers and companions to their own gifts and wisdom.
Thank you for that, Mark. And one of the things I love is that you circle some themes that are familiar, but you always have different stories to tell and different ways of packaging things, different metaphors. And on that note, I thought it might be interesting for you to tell us the story behind the title. What does that mean to you, falling down and getting up?
Yeah, as Allison mentioned, that the opening, it does come from this phrase, this answer that medieval monks, when asked how to practice their faith, said by falling down and getting up. And I relate to that. No one's exempt from that. And we're constantly challenged to get up one more time than we fall, to open one more time than we close, to put things together one more time than they are taken apart or we are taken apart. And so as I started to explore this, it's not surprising that other traditions have similar sayings. In the Japanese tradition, there's a proverb that goes, fall down 7, get up 8. Fall down 7, get up 8. And so, you know, this reminded me that when I was years ago going through my cancer journey, you know, I had a rib removed from my back surgically, and I was barely awake when this kind but kind of gruff nurse was leaning over me and she said, get up, we're going to walk. And I thought, who's going to walk? You don't mean me. And then she leaned over more softly and said, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Come on. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And then, you know, since I've been exploring the book, there was yet another, and this is an ancient metaphor about this, and that's from the Hindu Upanishads. Now, the Upanishads in the Hindu tradition are the holy sacred texts. You know, they're like the Old Testament and the New Testament in the Judeo-Christian tradition, but they're anonymous. They are believed to have been written at the feet of unseen masters. And there's just, oh my God, dozens of amazing metaphors. And there's one in there where they speak about how a caterpillar moves. It will stretch itself out and then it actually bunches itself up going back, and then it moves forward, and then it bunches up. So it's actually going 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And this in the Hindu Upanishads is used to say this is the pace of spiritual growth. And so no one likes to fall down. No one signs up for it. But we all do. It's like we can't escape gravity. So when we back up enough, we can see that actually falling down and getting up over a lifetime is a dance. And we have to learn, each of us, how to do that dance and what it looks like for each of us.
Beautiful, Mark. Thank you. There's a section of this book that you've actually taught a 3-series webinar on: the deeper teachers, fear, pain, and grief. So I know how much there is to unpack, and yet I'm going to ask you about it anyway. Tell us more about why fear, pain, and grief are the deeper teachers.
Yeah, thank you, Brooke. And as I was working on the book during the pandemic, I heard from so many of you, my students and readers from near and far, asking if I might open up a space where we could explore fear, pain, and grief. And that turned into such a deep and rich sharing, really everywhere, online and in person, that I've been going, that it forms the center of this whole book, the very center section. And because fear, pain, and grief, like it or not, are deeper teachers. Everyone, again, everyone who's ever lived will be given the chance to be dropped into the depth of life. Now, it often happens through pain, fear, and grief, or through a life-threatening illness like I had with cancer, or a sudden loss. But let's be clear, it's not just through these difficult challenges. We could be dropped into the depth of life through surprise or wonder or joy, or the sudden appearance of grace, or being loved unconditionally for the very first time. So I talk about cancer because that was my catalyst into the depth of life. But however it comes, once we're broken open, then the deeper journey begins. Then we start relating to things larger than us. And along the way, sooner or later, we all encounter fear, pain, and grief. And so this leads us to, and again, I explore this all much more deeply in the book. We can just touch on it and bookmark it here. But one of the things about being human that we all do as well is we tend to inflate and deflate. That is, make larger or smaller our sense of ourself and the nature of our experience. And so much of what the initial teaching from fear, pain, and grief is for us to right size and see ourselves and to see things as they are, because then we have real choices. And this can help us with fear and pain, but grief is another matter. We could do a whole, which, as we have, as you mentioned, a whole webinar and weekend retreat on grief alone, because grief changes. Grief blows up the landscape as we know it, and so therefore nothing is ever the same. And we have to, when we're hurting, we have to start making new maps. So one of the things I try to offer in this book is how we can uncover and personalize ways where we can right size our pain and fear, and how we can move with our grief into the new world that's in front of us.
It's a powerful insight, this idea of right sizing, and I hope that we'll come back to that more in the Q&A later. I want to cover some of these bigger picture questions, because you've written so many books over the years. As we said in the introduction, this is number 25. So I'd love to hear some of the life lessons you've discovered that mean the most to you through all that you've uncovered, lived through, and written about.
Yeah, thank you. And And it's amazing. I mean, I 20. It's amazing me to say that sentence. I've published 25 books because it's more than I ever imagined, honestly, as a young man. And I think, like anything, and people can relate to this, any kind of work we do over time, there was no pattern or path forward. It's only looking back that I can see the lessons,
Hmm.
that there actually was a pattern. And so some of the thresholds that I've learned over time, and I think so, what happens over time is that an inner curriculum is revealed. Our experience for each of us reveals an inner curriculum. And so some of the things that I've kind of explored over my life so far, and that I open with all of my teaching and in my books try to keep making sense of, one is to awaken to the paradox and true gifts of suffering. Another is to seeing obstacles as teachers. Another is understanding creativity as an expressive form of healing. Regardless of what we create, it's actually a healing thing to be involved in creativity and expression. And as you know, Brooke, one of my books, Drinking from the River of Light, explores this. The entire book explores this. Another is exchanging the want to be great for the great chance to just be. Another, which follows from that, is understanding how giving attention is more essential than getting attention. And two more that have been real teachers for me is how to learn from the acceptance of our limitations. And the final one, at least of this set, is awakening to how we need each other to be complete and useful. And that, of course, informs one of my other books, More Together Than Alone.
Yeah, your library is just a deep well for people who are just on this journey of life, because there's so many important topics here. But I want to zoom in on that one of working with what we're given. Can you talk a bit more about that one?
Oh, sure. I mean, this has been a humbling lesson to me, especially after almost dying in my 30s. And let me first say that there's nothing wrong with working for things we want. But if all we do is work for what we want, a lot of times we have a dream and then we sanctify it and we make it holy. And then if we reach it, phew, okay, wow, I guess I'm a success. And if we miss or are led astray from that dream, then we think we're a failure. And I've learned over decades that that's not a very helpful measurement of success or failure, not whether I get what I want or not. And
Hmm.
that actually working for what I want has often been an apprenticeship for working for what I've been given. And it's through working with what we're given that our soul shows itself. And so, again, our dreams and our goals are often wonderful things. And certainly what I want, I don't like, I don't want my wife Susan to die. That's very important. But if I want a new car, well, I might be disappointed, but that's not very important. So, but what often happens, I've discovered in my life, is that we work for what's in view, and it often leads us to something we couldn't have foreseen. And so our heart initiates us into to what's ahead of us. So often we give our all and we work for our dreams, and a lot of times our dreams don't come true. But I would say that that doesn't mean we're a failure, because often our dreams don't come true, but in giving our all to them, sometimes we come true, and that's much, much more important. So let me share a story here about this. And this is the story, this is a historical story of the monk Tetsugen. Now, Tetsugen lived in the 1700s in Japan, and his dream, his vision, his call, or maybe it was the 1600s, I can't recall right now, but anyway, in Japan, the talks of Buddha, the Dharma talks, were not yet translated into Japanese. And he thought, wow, I think I'm supposed to do that. And so he set about translating it, and he enlisted an artist friend of his who he said, look, you make these beautiful woodblock prints. Why don't you illustrate them? I'll translate them, and while we're doing that, we'll beg alms to have enough to publish the holy talks of Buddha in Japanese. And so they set about working. Well, they worked for a good 10 years, and there was a flood in northwest Japan where Tetsugen had grown up, and so he gave all the money away to help the people where he grew up. And they kept translating and and doing the wood blocks and had to get more money again. So they went through this whole thing again, and between 20 and 25 years, 10 more years or so later, now there was a famine in another part of Japan, and Tetsugen's heart had been opened and said, well, I didn't grow up here, but what's the difference? And he gave the money away again. And finally, after 25 years, he did it. They did it. They published the Dharma talks, a selection of them in Japanese. And in Kyoto, in a museum today, one of those original copies is under glass, and the plaque reads, in his lifetime, Tetsugen published 3 versions of the holy text. Only one is visible. Only one is visible. And so he, in this story, in this historical story of his life, he actually got to do both. He did do what he set out to do, but he was meant to embody Buddha's talks by being kind and generous. And that led to 2 more versions of the holy text.
Mm. Another powerful metaphor through story. So, Mark, at the beginning of the book, an early chapter, you talk about the difference between healing and justice, which seems like such an important topic for our time. And so I was wondering if you could unpack that for us a bit.
Yeah, and again, so these are kind of offerings that I would say of insights that I've stumbled onto over time. And so, healing and justice, we at their very best, they're one and the same. And often, though, in the real world, one will come before the other, and hopefully one will lead to the other. But what I discovered in two books ago in the Book of Soul, that the word war actually goes back to an Indo-European root word, and it means confusion. So when you think about that, that makes a lot of sense, because all war and conflict comes from confusion. So as I reflected on this and I looked at things in history and in my life, I discovered the notion that we can understand healing as the clearing of confusion within us. And likewise, we can understand justice as the clearing of confusion between us. So the ever-present question for a spiritual warrior, now, what's a spiritual warrior? Well, that's not a military warrior. A spiritual warrior is one committed to a life of transformation. So the question for any spiritual warrior is, how can we live this twin practice? How can we serve healing by clearing confusion within us? And how can we serve justice by clearing confusion between us? So at this point, and I often do this in our webinars and circles in person, let me offer those who are with us, this is an invitation for a take-home journal question. So tomorrow, next week, whenever you feel moved, if you feel moved, can you describe in your journal a confusion within you and how you might begin to clear it? And then later, maybe the next day, can you describe in your journal a confusion between you and another and how you might begin to clear it? And finally, maybe a week later, after looking at both of them, can you discuss all this with a friend or trusted loved one? All of this always, in my books and in my teaching circles, the invitation for you to personalize whatever we look at together.
Thank you, Mark. And as I'm moving into my final question here, there's just two things I want to say while we have full audience. One is please start to put your questions into the chat there in YouTube, because we'll be curating those and pulling them. And so now's a great time to start to put them in. And second, Mark, just because you may have some, I'm sure you have people who follow you closely, but for those of you who have stumbled upon this for whatever reason, Mark teaches regular online and in-person classes. And I just have to say that out loud now, because all these topics that we're circling, I just have felt so lucky to be in conversation with you over these years and in so many different circles. So, so thank you for that.
Oh, thank you, Brooke. Thank you.
So what is your hope for anyone engaging with this book?
Well, with this book, my hope is that something here will help you how to befriend your fear, pain, and grief, so you're not crippled by it. And my hope is that maybe through the book, you might discover 2 or 3 specific ways to move forward in your own journey to an authentic life. You might find 2 or 3 actual practices that you can add to your toolbox. And of course, my hope in all my work and my teaching is that you will be more deeply introduced to your own gifts and your own wisdom. So thank you, Brooke. And Brooke will be coming back when we on the other end of my sharings here, so that we can have a conversation with all of you. And we'll give more details at the end, but Brooke and I will be offering an in-depth 3-session webinar later this month on the new book, Falling Down and Getting Up. So here in the middle part of our time today, I do want to share with you and read some poems and share some stories mostly from the Half-Life of Angels, and things that support the themes of falling down and getting up. And so let me start with, and again, I learn by what I write. I don't understand these things before they come through, and that's an important thing to share, because introspection is a great gift for all of us. I just happen to write down what I reflect on and feel. You don't have to write it down. So here, this couplet, there's 2 lines I want to share as a way to open this part that have still being my teacher, and they came to me probably in the last year, and it's simply this: being hardened will help us get through life, but being softened will let us experience life. Being hardened will help us get through life, but being softened will let us experience life. So I want to share this first story, which goes all the way back to the Book of Awakening, because it centers on the power of touch and connection, which, of course, after the pandemic, we've realized even more is so important. So this is a story of a walk I went on through Central Park, right by the Central Park Zoo in New York City many years ago. We wandered into a corner of the Central Park Zoo, and there, despite the dozens of tourists, they were pointing and tapping the glass, there were 2 monkeys squatting on a perch of stone. To our surprise, they were both in deep sleep, their dark heads bowed to each other, and their small frames were limp. And what was amazing to me was that their small, delicate hands were touching, their monkey fingers leaning into each other. Well, it was clear that it was this small, sustained touch that allowed them to sleep. And as long as they were touching, they could let go. I envied their trust and their simplicity. There was none of the human pretense at independence. They clearly needed each other to have any sense of peace. And when one stirred but didn't wake, the other, still while asleep, kept their fingers touching. How deeply rewarding the life of touch. They looked like ancient travelers praying inside a place of rest made possible because they dared to stay connected. It was one of the most tender and humble moments I've ever seen. Two aging monkeys weaving fingertips, as if their touch alone kept them from oblivion. I pray for the courage to be as simple in asking for what I need to simply be, to simply be. And this poem is from The Half-Life of Angels, and it's about the wisdom of our dog Zuzu. It's a dog poem for those of you who are dog people, and it's called The Mute Sage. When the jar fell off the counter and broke, our dog went to lick up the honey, but we were afraid she'd cut herself on the broken glass. You kept her back while I swept up the slivers. Later that night, it occurred to me that this is what it is to be human, always going for the honey while tiptoeing around the glass. The next week it was so cold that ice stuck to our dog's pads. We had to stop every block or so to free her feet from clumps of ice. Well, this too was a lesson, for without warmth, we simply can't make our way. As I write this, she dreams whatever dogs dream, and I keep looking for whatever humans look for. Everything is a teacher before us, everything. And given the new book, Falling Down and Getting Up, I wanted to share this poem about that, and it's called Anthem. Yes, you fell down. I feel for you, for I have fallen many times. Now you must get up. I know it isn't easy. I know it will take time. Remember, the seed can't imagine breaking ground, and the fledgling can't imagine flying, and so your broken heart can't imagine finding its way. But life is this repeating journey from sleep to wakefulness, from blindness to sight, from fear to love. No matter how many times we fall, we're just beginning. Again, if we back up far enough, falling down and getting up becomes a dance, And so it's incumbent on us. We can't avoid the dance, just like we can't avoid gravity. So how do we become skilled at it? We don't have to seek out falling, but we have to become skilled at it when we encounter it. So we can, as the Japanese say, fall down 7, get up 8. Well, this poem is a poem about grief, and I want to share this because some of you have requested it kindly. This is a poem called Adrift, and several years ago, probably about 8, 9 years ago now, there was a period of time where my wife Susan and I, about 18 months, we went through many losses within that brief time period. We lost Susan's mom, Eleanor, and we lost both my parents, as well as my dear friend and mentor, Joel Elkes, as well as our former dog child, Mira. So all these losses within 18 months. And I fell one day, in a beautiful day like today, on our deck in our home here. I just fell into the chasm of grief. And I tripped into this deep learning, not because of any wisdom on my part, but because I was too tired and grief-stricken to resist it. This poem is called Adrift. Everything is beautiful, and I am so sad. This is how the heart makes a duet of wonder and grief. The light spraying through the lace of the fern is as delicate as the fibers of memory forming their web around the knot in my throat. The breeze makes the birds move from branch to branch, as this ache makes me look for those I've lost in the next room, in the next song, in the laugh of the next stranger, in the very center under it all, what we have that no one can take away, and all that we've lost face each other. It is there that I'm adrift, feeling punctured by a holiness that exists under everything. I am so sad, and everything is beautiful. So this is a good example of what I mean by retrieving the poem. Because I was in that moment of deep, inexplicable grief, and yet everything around me was beautiful, because I followed it and stayed true to it, I was given an insight. And the insight at the end there, which I didn't know before I followed the feeling, was that in the center, under it all, where what we have that no one can take away, how that faces everything we have lost. That's a paradox. And it's there that I'm adrift, feeling punctured by a holiness that exists under everything. And of course, when we express ourselves personally, that clears us out to be open to receive and feel and express life other than our own. And this is the rhythm, not only in writing, but in living a life of compassion. If I don't open up or clear out my own, process my own feelings and thoughts and entanglements, then I'm not clear enough to receive other life. So this is in order to write about other characters, in order to have compassion about other people we meet, we have to process our own experience. So a poem like what I just read enables me to read a poem, retrieve and read a poem to you. The next one is called Swordless. This is exploring the life of an old samurai warrior who gave up being a samurai. This is called Swordless. They said the old samurai, tired of being on guard, gave his sword away. It took months to accept a life without armor, months to let his wounds turn into blossoms. In time, he took to long walks along the river where he would sit alone and play the one-string koto. Sought out by a young soldier, the former hero listened into dusk and simply said, "I have looked my whole life for the one string." When the would-be warrior asked about greatness, the swordless samurai replied, "Understanding life is like tossing a scarf in the air and watching it drape its way to the ground." Understanding life is like tossing a scarf in the air and watching it drape its way to the ground. So, many of you from reading my work or being with me in circles, you know that I had a long, difficult journey with my parents. Loved them as I did, and I loved me as they did. And they've been gone about 8 or 9 years. And so, even especially since they're gone, I've been learning more about them and about our struggle. And this is a poem called Life Tracks. It's a small poem, and like railroad tracks. This is Life Tracks. And I'll read it twice, it's short. My mother taught me how to build a wall. My father showed me how to climb it. They never said so, but they loved the wall and called it home. In time, I grew like a chick in its shell. Inevitably, I cracked the wall to live my life. They never forgave me. Life Tracks. My mother taught me how to build a wall. My father showed me how to climb it. They never said so, but they loved the wall and called it home. In time, I grew like a chick in its shell. Inevitably, I cracked the wall to live my life. They never forgave me. So one of the things is that now that they've been gone 8 or 9 years, 10 years almost, um, the insights settle in me with less judgment and less difficulty. So, my parents who were born they lived through the Great Depression, 1920s. My father born in 1920, my mother 1926. We had family die in the Holocaust. They were very focused on survival for my brother and me. Very intelligent people, but very literal minded. And so they get a mystical poet for a son. We didn't speak the same language. And so there was inherent difficulty between us. We needed different things to live. Now, I actually was much closer to my grandmother, my father's mother, who was a mythic figure in my life. And so here's a poem from the Half-Life of Angels about Grandma Minnie from Brooklyn, called Never Lost, Always Found. On the darkest night of the year, Susan asks about Grandma Minnie yet again. And again I soften and speak of being a child in your Brooklyn kitchen, sitting next to your stove as you made latkes, patting the excess oil and giving them to me while they were warm. And Susan jumps up, as she does every year, as if for the first time, and starts grating potatoes. I put on klezmer music and we make latkes and eat standing in the kitchen. Our dog jumps to the music or to the presence of something unseen. I grab her paws and we dance briefly to the music of the old world. And here's a small poem called Like That. And I will also read this one twice because it's short. I can't take away your pain or save you from your life, but holding the one who is suffering is the only raft we have. Putting your palm on the surface of a lake, you can feel the entire lake. Compassion is like that. I can't take away your pain or save you from your life, but holding the one who is suffering is the only raft we have. Putting your palm on the surface of a lake, you can feel the entire lake. Compassion is like that. This next poem tells the story of just before the pandemic. I was speaking at a college in Florida, and after the talk, I was back at the hotel, and it was about 12:30, quarter to 1 at night, and all of a sudden the phone rang, and it was my wife Susan. And instead of saying hello, all of a sudden I hear her very upset in the phone going, "Your dog is a murderer." I said, "Oh, is everything all right, honey?" And and apparently our dog Zuzu had chased and caught a possum in the yard. And so this is the story of that incident and what we learned from it. It's called Secret of the Night. You called the hotel to say that Zuzu had killed a possum. It was lying near the bird feeder with its tongue sticking out. You were so upset and I was so far away. You said, "I'll have to bury it." I said, "Use the snow shovel, put it in the woods," thinking, let it stay in the labyrinth of nature. In the morning, it was gone. You were relieved, but compelled to find out more. You texted me on the plane. It is an unconscious reflex that lets them enter that state when they're threatened. They seem to go away until what is hunting them leaves them alone. If we could only learn how. You could have gone there as a child when your father came home drunk and full of rage. And I could have gone there when my mother slapped my face extra hard because I asked why she was so mean. I'm 35,000 feet up, wanting the possum to teach us, so we who have been threatened might go there like a crowd of stars, out of reach of all harm. So here the possum is the teacher. The possum is the teacher. You know, when I was young, I think I talked too much. And I think it was because, you know, as a young mystical poet, as I started to feel and experience the oneness of life, the paradoxes of life, so many different aspects of being, you know, I didn't really have anyone to talk to about it as a young undergraduate. In fact, a lot of people, you know, kind of backed away, like Seinfeld in his famous episode where he says, "Oh, good luck with all that." And so I think the more that I couldn't talk about it, uh, the more I tried to talk about it, and so I talked too much. And so, um, looking back on that led to this poem called "Under All the Fuss." Under all the fuss. Over the years, I talked so much that, like a car speeding down a dirt road, I couldn't see anything but what I stirred up with all my talk. Thankfully, loss broke my axle and forced me to stop. When the dust settled, I could see. Then love picked me up and took me to the nearest town, where I started a school for seekers who talk too much. In time, though, we taught each other to listen like dragonflies who touch the water without making a ripple. Now to listen is to breathe with my heart. Now I have so little to say that strangers think I'm a nobody, just when I'm finally becoming everybody. And this is a poem called Dropping the Moon. Dropping the Moon. And it's about, I guess, how we can so easily be shaped by the reactions and opinions of others, and how that can distract us from hearing our own heart and soul speak. Dropping the moon. Someone, not meaning to, was critical and dismissive, and I couldn't stop replaying the cut. 2 days later, a man I respect said I mattered, but I couldn't quite hold on to it. At first, I thought, this is a modern malady, replaying what is dark, always dropping the moon. But then I felt the pulse of everything, felt the music beneath the notes, the water beneath the waves, felt God beneath the many lives we live, and then I stopped lying to the me that wouldn't believe, stopped refusing the me that honestly deeply knows. I am what lives beneath all that I construct and burn. I am the light, the moon, and the shadow, and the time it takes to return. And one of the quiet courages that I've experienced and that I offer encourage each of you who are with us today is to outweight those human responses of rejection and misguidance and indifference, so you can hear the truth of your own soul. So you can hear the truth of your own soul. So I'm going to share 2 or 3 more poems, and then I'll invite Brooke back on so we can have a conversation and explore your questions. This is a more recent poem, and this is called Spiritual Physics. The prophet Zarathustra, whose name means undiluted star, he said that gravity is the irrefutable force of love that binds us together. And the Chinese sage Mencius, he said that our impulse to drop everything to save a child from falling into a well, this holds everything together. And the rabbis of Eastern Europe, they rang their bells at dawn like spiritual roosters, barking that God is dormant until you are in relationship. They would chant, "Get up and make God visible." Isn't this how we complete each other? When I walk our dog, I wave to the mailman driving from house to house, though I still don't know his name. At the register in the supermarket, I have the same small exchange with Betty about her arthritis every time I buy milk and bread. And when I board the plane, I have the same brief intimacy with Darren, the gate agent. He has 2 grown kids, one who won't speak to him. And there was the old man waiting to buy 2 peaches, but they were only sold by the bunch, so he left. And I watched the woman behind me run to the produce aisle and then to the parking lot to say, "Here, have them all." These small exchanges make God visible. They hold everything together. They arc us one to the other until the gravity of love binds us. So for God's sake, say hello. I think this is one of the simplest lessons and barriers we have to cross after so much insulation of the pandemic, of social media, of the bubbles we're in. For God's sake, say hello. So let me share 2 more and then we'll have a conversation. This poem is called Unraveled. It's as if God squeezes this beautiful, terrible day like a lemon, and those caught in the grip grow so tender that there's nowhere left to go. Others not caught in the squeeze don't understand there are things to do and bills to pay, but all the plans against disaster have been squeezed out of you, and the bee nuzzling its face in the nectar of the peony seems now like the end of all your questions. And finally, and I so appreciate being able to have a conversation like Brooke and I have had first, and to share some of these stories and poems with you, to open up this heart space. This poem is another example of one I couldn't have written when I was younger, because the poetry, it's not lines on a page, it's the unexpected utterance of the soul that comes to us after living. And this one came to me many years after many years of living. So this is called Praying I Will Find. I used to have so many plans, good plans, grand plans. In the beginning, I would be annoyed by the calamities I'd meet along the way that would keep me from my plans. I used to pride myself on how I could get back on track so quickly. But the more I loved and the more I suffered, the more my plans were interrupted by those in need. Eventually, the call of life, unexpected and unrehearsed, made Swiss cheese of my plans. Now, like an emperor undressed by time, I wander the days naked of plans, praying I will find love to give and suffering to heal before the sun goes down. So let me pause there and invite Brooke back on so we can have a conversation with you.
Thank you, Mark. Such beautiful words, and so many different points of entry. So I am going to start with some of the questions that have been coming through on the YouTube live stream. And again, welcome everybody to put any questions that you might have, because we have the time for it. So a question from Maynard, who asked, Mark, what special insights have you cultivated in falling up to transform your travails into writing, speaking, and embodying such beautiful poetry?
Oh, well, thank you. I think, the more that I go here through the years, I've discovered that what is the creative process for me is really the introspective process that everyone's a part of. As I mentioned earlier, I just happen to write it down, but it's really useful. And so I would offer that speaking the truth of our experience, especially when we're going through difficulty, is empowering. The most powerful thing we can do when powerless is to speak the truth of where we are. And that leads and brings into view our next engagement with life. And so, there's a lot of, we always talk about being an introvert or an extrovert. And, it doesn't really matter whether you're very comfortable with others or not. There's always a line for everyone. And I've come to understand that actually I would describe myself, I'm an introvert who decided years ago just to be an introvert everywhere, which has meant that I just welcome you inside. And when you meet me, we discover again and again that when I go far enough into me, I meet you. And when you go far enough into you, you meet me, and we meet in that holy center. And drinking from that center makes us more together than alone. So I think that the biggest thing I've learned is to trust our heart and to keep practicing the courage of speaking the truth of where we are. Because that leads not only to reconnecting ourselves to life, but reconnecting ourselves to each other.
Thanks, Mark. I wonder if we could go back to risk, another topic that you've written an entire book on. And just because it is so important, and you've been circling it a bit today, talking about, risking saying hello, but you said that dichotomy of managing risk and enhancing risk. And I wonder
Yeah,
if you could just speak to that tension a little.
sure. And I actually, I actually learned this uh, years ago when I was invited, probably in my 40s, to lead a day retreat or workshop for a small group of corporate bankers, about 15. And quite honestly, my first thought was, do you guys have the wrong number? Like, which really betrayed my own stereotypes. Okay. And so they said, I think somebody must have probably read the Book of Awakening and said, I know you don't know this guy, but trust me, let's try something. So, but anyway, we started the day and it wasn't going well. They were very resistant and quiet. And so about mid-morning, I said, can we just take a long coffee break? And we went into another conference room. We had donuts and coffee. And I went around and to each, so I spent a little time with each person, asking them essentially, I don't really know what you do. Tell me what you do. Like, what's your gift? What's going on? Why are you doing this? Other than it pays the rent, like, what's your thing? And every one of them in different language said to me, our gift is managing risk. Whether you have a little money or a lot, you've worked hard for it. Our job is to make sure you don't lose it. And as soon as they said that, I got it. And I said, okay, let's go back in the other room. And I said to them directly, your gift is managing risk. Mine is enhancing risk. So can we spend the rest of the day teaching each other? And that changed everything. Because the truth is, and I learned from that initial threshold, every person has to be good at both. We have, just like you need two good legs to walk and two good eyes to see, without two good eyes, there's no depth perception. So so in the outer world, we have to manage risk. We have to assess what is dangerous and foolish. And if we see clearly, we don't have to be overprotective. Because if we're overprotective, if we manage risk too much, we stop living life. We wind up hiding from life. So in the inner world, I learned, and this is the work of a poet and my work as a teacher, my gift is enhancing risk, because inwardly you don't grow unless you take risk. Now then as I lived with those things, I started to learn, boy, as human beings, we often crisscross those things. If we manage risk internally, we don't grow, but our need to grow doesn't go away. So what happens? It comes out sideways, and we start taking needless risks out in the world. We start doing dangerous things. We start doing adventure. We start racing fast cars or climbing mountains without ropes, anything to give us meaning, because we're not taking risk where it's natural to take risk and growthful inwardly. So we have to learn where and how to be good at both. I knew I had a friend earlier in life, was a remarkable a young man. We were in our 30s, and he was a remarkable surgeon at that young age. And his avocation was climbing I guess there were 48 peaks in the world, and he was climbing every one of them. But every time we'd meet after he'd climbed one of these things, which was remarkable achievement on its own, because he didn't take internal risk to know who he was and what it meant to be alive. He didn't climb any inner mountains. Every time he came back, the same door that he hadn't opened was still there. Mm. And in one last thing about this, so to everyone who's listening, how can you become more intimate with your own practice of managing risk in the outer world where it's appropriate? And how can you enhance taking risks in the inner world so you can keep growing? And in the book Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse, when Siddhartha, the main character, tries all different walks of life to find what has meaning for him, he tries on gambling. He's gambling, and like an anthropologist, he gambles, and then afterwards he goes, and there's this beautiful line in the novel. He says, oh, I see. Gambling and chance is the substitute for genuine risk. So yes, one of my earliest books is The Exquisite Risk, right. Daring to live an authentic life, because we are all challenged to open life right where we are. And if we don't, we will chase it elsewhere for the stimulation that becomes a substitute for true meaning.
Thank you, Mark. Our friend Madison is with us.
Hi, Madison.
And asks, how do you view all the suffering in the world from a deeper perspective?
Wow, we could spend a few weeks on that. Let me speak to it a little bit. And of course, as I always say, I don't know, but let me speak to it. I think that suffering is to humans what erosion is to nature. Suffering in certain Buddhist texts, suffering is referred to as the friction of the wheel of life. So there is no avoiding suffering. This is different than the inadvertent and deliberate suffering we cause each other, what we do to each other as human beings. Because if we don't take risk, if we don't find meaning inwardly, we will inadvertently hurt each other. It spills out sideways. So that's different. that's a whole nother thing. And that's where we lean into healing. As I mentioned in our first conversation, healing is clearing confusion within us, and justice is clearing confusion between us, so we don't inadvertently hurt each other or deliberately cause pain. But suffering is, we can't avoid suffering any more than we can avoid gravity. And so how do we help each other through it? I think life has been made just difficult enough that we need each other to ensure the journey of love. And so suffering is a great teacher. And this is not to deify suffering. You don't have to look for it. No, nobody wants to suffer. As far back as Assyrian times, we're talking 5000 BC, there are verses that were found carved in clay that said, basically, I'd like just the good things, thank you. You can keep the difficult ones. So that's a very human response. But when we face it, we will, how do we enlarge our sense of things? How do we not get small? How do we ask for help? How do we hold each other up? And how do we open each other to, and this is a paradox, like the paradox in the poem about grief. How do we experience and face the pain and loss and grief that suffering opens, and not miss the deeper opening that it brings us to? There's a and this is actually, it was one of the things that led me to write that poem about the swordless, about the samurai who gives up his sword, because there was in history a samurai by the name of Masahide. He was a very accomplished samurai warrior who did give up his sword and retired, as you will, from being a warrior, and went to study with the famous Japanese poet Basho. He wanted to apprentice as a poet late in life. I would have loved to have interviewed that guy. Like, what happened, Masahide? And but his famous haiku, which will tell, it speaks to his lifelong experience. 3 lines. He said, "My barn having burned to the ground, I can see the moon more completely. My barn having burned to the ground, I can now see the moon more completely." And in those 3 lines, the suffering of the barn having burned to the ground is not to be minimized. That's real. That has its own lessons from those deeper teachers of loss and grief. And now that it's out of the way, oh my God, I had no idea this vastness was open. So that raises this deeper teacher as well, that is that what opens us is never as important as what is opened.
So Mark, I'd like to go back to right sizing pain and pain and fear you mentioned, and you said grief is sort of in its own bucket. So I see this a lot. I think I think it's because of social media, and there's more amplification sometimes, right, of expression of pain and fear and grief. And I just wondered if you could speak to that, in our modern culture where this is kind of where we emote and share. And there's a big support system there. And at the same time, sometimes I do have that sense of like, how do we right size this, or how do we know if we need to?
Yeah. Well, I think this goes back, there are many, so let's just say, because this is this human need interfaces, especially at this time in our history with technology. So let's just say, to begin with, that technology is a tool. It's like a power tool. Like, I'd rather use a power screwdriver than keep twisting my wrist. Okay, so it's a power tool. It's inert. It doesn't have intent or direction. We give it intent and direction. And so there are great gifts. Look at us here right now. Because of technology, we're able to share this way, though we're all over. And there, as we know, there are liabilities and problems that have come also because of technology not being used. So this is a good example that when we suffer, we need company. That's what compassion is all about. So it might seem that through social media or our devices or our tablets that we're connecting, but only so far. We're really not. You know, Rilke, the great German poet, Austrian poet, he said in a line on one of his poems, he said, "I am alone, but not alone enough to make every moment holy." And so one of the unintended problems of social media and reality TV and the installation of technology is that even when I'm alone on my phone or my tablet or my computer, I'm not really alone. I think I'm alone, and I'm not really in community. I'm in a digital netherworld. And so I expend all this energy and I don't get the being held or heard or seen that happens when we really are in real presence and contact, which doesn't mean we can't do that through the media, but often we don't. Just like with a show, and I'm not picking on any shows in particular, but whether it's American Idol or Survivor, whatever these things might be, okay, I get all invested, I get all worked up, I can even vote as if I'm experiencing relationship, and then the show's over and I turn it off and I've expended my relational energy and I haven't been held or seen or heard. So now I'm exhausted and I'm still alone. That's why, for God's sake, say hello. And this raises, I think, a problem in the modern world, the problem of progress. So let me briefly touch on this. And that is, so let me frame it this way. So, you know, my father, who I mentioned, he never traveled much in his life. And we used to subscribe to National Geographic because he would love to look at pictures from all over the world. Well, now in my life, I can go on YouTube and I can literally go find a video and be over someone's shoulder as they're climbing Mount Everest. Well, that's great because I'll never climb Mount Everest. But one of the insidious problems of modern technology is I can very easily think I made the climb. I didn't. I didn't make the climb. It's wonderful as a voyeur. As long as I know that I didn't make the climb. And so without actually reaching out to another, without actually responding to another, you know, we're not having relationship that can be healing. It can touch us briefly, but not enough where we can heal each other. And so the tool is great, but it can't be a substitute for the climb of being human. We can't. So that's where, like if you and I text each other and we happen to live near each other, and you tell me that you're struggling, and I'm telling you, oh, I feel for you. Well, I can hang up the phone and like go over and see you. No, it's not the same. And that's something that we have to remember and inhabit in the modern world.
Yeah, it's important and a challenging one too. The question from Vita about the steps that you might go through for people who are, just living or just surviving to thriving. So sort of a prescriptive question. Is there something that
Yeah.
you do?
And so let me just share a few feelings and thoughts about that. I don't have a ABC of how to, but I know for me, a couple of things that always work or have mostly worked. One for me, myself, and that for any of you that are just by yourselves, is when I'm struggling, when I'm confused, in fear, in pain, I try to stop and give my full heart's attention to the nearest piece of life before me until it becomes my teacher. It could be a fly on a window. Life will always be a resource if we open our heart to it. And so we don't have to learn something, we don't have to go somewhere. We can simply open our heart, and this is a quiet courage, where we are. Stop. Another thing is to try to drop what's in the way or what's troubling so that you can reconnect with your heart. You know, I have a small poem of mine called Practicing. It goes like this: as a man in his last breath drops all he is carrying, each breath is a little death that can set us free. And it's very human, you know. If I still, even though I know this, if I'm struggling or I'm afraid or I'm working something in my mind, I think if I go over it one more time, maybe I'll figure it out, or maybe I'll feel better. Well, I don't know about you, but it never works, because the only thing to do is to drop it, take a breath, and reconnect and start again. And the other thing I would offer, and there's a whole chapter in the new book about that there are 4 endless eternal vows that are always helpful. And they are, and they are: help, thank you, I'm sorry, and I love you. Help, thank you, I'm sorry, and I love you. When we are on either side of those vows, if we authentically express that or authentically respond, we will help heal each other. We will help each other be more completely here and connected to life. So that's just a beginning of some of the things that I've stumbled into.
I love those vows, and I've written them down from your previous teachings just as a point of reference. It's great
Oh,
to keep
thank
those
you.
in mind. A question about parenting. As a parents, how do we deal with the experience of suffering when our children are suffering?
Well, I think, and first let me preface this by saying, you know, I don't have children, but I was a child, so I have some experience. Um, but I just want to qualify. I think just like with any age, I think with children, it's so important to respect that the depth of their souls, even as little ones. And I know, you know, I'm godfather to 3. My dear friend Robert's 3 kids who are now in their mid 30s and 40. But I remember a moment when their parents, Robert and their mother, Vonda, were Eli, the youngest, was getting ready to go from a tricycle to a 2-wheeler. And I overheard this simple, I'm sure parents have had this, both sides of this conversation forever, but it really stayed with me. So just before he was getting on the 2-wheeler, Vaughn wanted to run alongside so that he wouldn't fall. And Robert said, well, he's going to fall. I want to be there to help him up. And I thought, they both are so loving. And doesn't that cover it all? You know, that we can't, you know, of course, if I see something that's going to hurt you, I want to try to get in the way and prevent it. You know, if a glass is falling and you don't see it, I want to somehow get in the way, obviously. But for many of the things we've been talking about inwardly, you can't prevent another being. And that's where the life of compassion comes in. How do we give the people we love the support and tools so that they can heal themselves, so that they have the ability to process this mystery of life that we experience, that you know, that no one can do for us, and yet no one can do alone.
Thank you, Mark. There might be time for 1 or 2 more questions. We'll see how we do here. I wanted to go back to the your poem this final stanza, no matter how many times we fall, we are just beginning. And I just thought it's kind of a paradox in that it's sort of tragic and hopeful at the same time. And I wondered if we might end on your thoughts about the fact that we just always keep falling.
Yeah, well, I think that, I was just teaching out of the new book, as you know, in Connecticut at a great, wonderful retreat center, Mercy by the Sea. And one of the elders in the room was a nun who was close to 90. And she listened, it was a very large group, about 100 people for the weekend. And she listened all weekend. And then at the very end, she raised her hand and said, I fall a lot more than I did earlier in my life. And people wonderfully helped me up. But she said, before they help me up, I know I have to feel the downness before I can get up.
Mm.
And it made me think of which I talk about in the book, that when I was a little boy in recess, as a eighth, seventh grader, sixth, earlier even, fourth, fifth grade, and I really skinned my knee for the first time. It was scratched up, a little bloody, and I fell, and I realized before I started crying and blah, 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 I had never had felt the entire earth. My whole body was on the earth. And for the first time in my life, I actually realized there was something that was holding me up, that was holding all of us up. And I think that's a great metaphor for feeling the downness of things, is so that we can feel the buoyancy, not just of the literal earth, but of the mystical unity that holds us up.
Thank you for that, Mark. I see Allison's back, and I think we have some announcements, closing messages, perhaps.
Let's just make a few announcements, and then we'll turn it back to Allison. And thank you all, and thank you, Brooke, so much. A couple of online announcements and in person. So first is that, as some of you know, Brooke teaches very moving and dynamic online courses on memoir writing. So if that speaks to any of you, please go to magicofmemoir.com. And as I mentioned, we are going to offer at the end of this month a 3-session webinar on in depth on falling down and getting up. It'll be October 29th, November 5th, and 19th, 3 successive Sundays. And you can go to live.marknepo.com to find out about that. And the other 2 things I would share, in-person events. Actually, in November 9 through 12, I will be near you, Allison, in San Rafael at Santa Sabina, offering a 4-day retreat in person there. So you can go to santasabinacenter.org. And the final thing is, here in Michigan, where I live, I offer year-long journeys for a small group of people that meet, 16 people that meet 4 weekends over a year. And there's actually, for the one starting next year, there's 1 spot left. And you can go to my website, marknepo.com, to find out more about those things. So thank you, Brooke and Allison and Zach and everyone at Book Passage. It's wonderful to be able to be with you like this. And thanks everyone for being here today.
My pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It was really hard to come back on when I was listening, and I thought, oh, I have to show up and end this, and I don't want to. It was so amazing. And I was sitting here and I kept writing things down on my phone, that I wanted to remember. And I already looked up the 3-day 3-session online workshop. But what I felt when I was listening, what came up for me is that you speak with humor, humanity, and humility. And that, to me, I mean, it's just so special. And I was so honored to be able to introduce you and close this out. And I want to encourage everybody to purchase this book. There's some wonderful surprises, including a black and white picture. I'm not going to tell you what it is. You have to buy the book to look at it, but it's really special. And and just wonderful words to live by and think about. And so I so appreciate you, Mark and Brooke, and I appreciate all of you who are watching, for tuning in and supporting Mark and Brooke and Book Passage. And remember, by supporting Book Passage, you're supporting independent bookstores, which is very important. And also, I start saying right around this time of year, October 1st, that holidays are coming up and everybody should get a book. So here is a perfect one for you to start your shopping with. And with that, I want to just close out and say thank you again to all of you, and have a wonderful evening. Take care.
Thank you so much, Allison.
You're welcome.